Champagne flute, cold in my hand. String quartet working through something classical and inoffensive in the corner of the room. Candlelight doing what candlelight does at weddings, making everyone look forgiven. Then my mother's voice cut across the cocktail hour, bright, carrying, pitched exactly loud enough for the cluster of guests near the bar to hear every word of it without her ever having to admit she'd meant them to. Who let her in? I didn't flinch. I held the flute steady, kept my face perfectly, professionally still, the same face I use when a hospital board asks a question they already know the answer to and just want to watch me say it out loud. Freeze there for a second. Champagne bubbles. My mother's mouth still open around the word her. My own face, calm, unreadable. Then smash cut, because that moment isn't where this story starts. It's just where it finally circles back. 9 years earlier, my family put my entire life into black trash bags and left them on the porch, because I said no to medical school. Tonight, at my sister's wedding, a woman I'd met exactly twice would take a microphone, read my actual professional title out loud to a room full of people my mother had spent a decade telling a very different story about, and their myth would run out of air in real time, on a stage they'd built for someone else entirely. I'm Elena Voss. I didn't win that night with a speech. I didn't need one. I won because a stranger with a program in her hand said my name correctly, and the room believed her before it ever thought to check with my mother first. I want to walk you through all 9 of those years, because the wedding is only the payoff. The real story is everything I built in the years nobody in my family was watching, on purpose, without an audience, without a single person keeping score except me. In my family, dinner was an oral exam nobody warned you was being graded. My father, Dr. Marcus Voss, cardiology, quiet in the particular way men get quiet when they've decided disagreement is beneath their specialty. My mother, Dr. Helen Voss, oncology, not quiet at all, ambitious in a way that had long since stopped distinguishing between her patients' outcomes and her daughter's report cards. Love, in that house, wasn't a feeling. It was a ranking system, updated constantly, posted nowhere but felt everywhere. My older sister Claire was the trophy from the very beginning. Valedictorian, then pre-med, then early acceptance to the same medical school both our parents had attended, a pipeline so clean it barely required effort on anyone's part except Claire simply showing up and doing exactly what was expected of her, which, to be fair to her, she did extremely well. I was the willful one. That was the label, applied early and often, usually at dinner, usually right after I'd said something that revealed I found the human body more interesting as a system to organize care around than as a set of individual diagnoses to memorize and recite. I liked how hospitals actually ran. I liked the logistics of it, the scheduling, the research design, the quiet architecture behind whether a patient gets seen in 4 hours or 14. Nobody in my family considered that a real interest. It was, at best, a hobby adjacent to the family business, something to be tolerated until I came to my senses. The framed diplomas on the hallway wall told you everything about what counted as an achievement in that house. 2 from my parents, 1 from Claire's undergraduate honors program hung early, in anticipation, like a placeholder for the real one everyone assumed was coming. There was no wall space reserved for anything I might eventually produce, because nobody had yet imagined I might produce something worth framing. I remember one dinner in particular, I must have been 15, when Claire came home with a perfect score on an AP biology exam and my mother actually stood up from the table to hug her, a gesture I'd never once seen at that table for anything I'd brought home. A few weeks later, I won a regional essay competition on healthcare policy, my first real inkling of the field that would eventually become my career. My mother read the certificate, set it down on the counter, and asked whether the prize money would go toward SAT tutoring. There was no hug. There wasn't even a question about what the essay had actually said. Another time, a family friend, a pediatric surgeon my parents socialized with, asked me at a dinner party what I wanted to be when I grew up. I said, honestly, that I wanted to run a hospital someday, make the systems work better for patients. The table laughed, warmly, the way adults laugh at children who haven't yet learned to want something respectable. My mother corrected me, gently, in front of everyone. She means she wants to go into medicine. I didn't argue. I was 12. But I remember exactly how it felt to be edited in real time, in my own words, at my own dinner table. By the time Claire started her own application season, the entire household reorganized around it, quietly, without anyone announcing that it had. Dinner conversations became MCAT strategy sessions. Weekend mornings became practice interview drills, my father playing the role of stern admissions officer with an enthusiasm I never once saw him bring to anything of mine. I was 16 that year, expected to sit quietly through hours of this, occasionally handed a stopwatch and asked to time Claire's mock responses, an assistant in my own sister's coronation, a role I performed dutifully because refusing wasn't yet a muscle I'd learned how to use. I don't think Claire ever fully understood, back then, how differently the house treated us, because from where she stood, all she saw was support, structure, two parents fully invested in her success. It took me years to stop resenting her for that blindness and start recognizing it for what it actually was, the natural, unremarkable comfort of being the child the house was built around. She hadn't taken anything from me on purpose. The house had simply never been built with room for both of us to matter at the same time. The acceptance letters, when they came, weren't mine. They were the plans. Pre-med tracks at two of the same schools my parents had attended, already discussed with family friends on admissions committees before I'd even finished my own applications, a runway laid out for me to simply walk down without asking too many questions. I remember the exact evening I told them about my own application, separately, to the health administration program instead. I'd rehearsed the sentence for almost a week beforehand, in the shower, in my car, anywhere private enough to practice saying it without my voice shaking. When I finally said it out loud, at that same dinner table, my mother set her fork down so precisely, so quietly, that the silence that followed felt louder than any shout could have. I chose a different path instead, a master's program in health administration, with a focus on clinical operations, the exact field I'd been quietly fascinated by since I was old enough to notice how differently my father's private patients were treated compared to the ones who came through the ER at 3 a.m. Still health. Still service. Just not a white coat, and in my family, that distinction turned out to be the only one that actually mattered. My mother called it betrayal, using that exact word, at that exact table, with the framed diplomas watching from the hallway like witnesses for the prosecution. My father, ever the quiet enabler, added his own line a moment later, gentler in tone but no less final in meaning. Think of this family, Elena. Think of what we've built. As if what they'd built was a house I was obligated to keep occupying on their terms indefinitely, rather than a childhood I'd simply finished living through. I told them, as calmly as I could manage at 19, that I wasn't rejecting medicine. I was choosing a different room in the same building. Nobody in that kitchen was interested in the distinction. They'd already decided which room counted. My mother spent the better part of an hour that night listing names, people from her graduating class, colleagues' children, a cousin twice removed who'd wasted a good mind on something outside medicine and had, in her telling, regretted it every year since. It wasn't a conversation. It was a closing argument, delivered to a jury of one who'd already made up her mind and simply hadn't been informed yet that the verdict wasn't hers to hand down. My father tried, once, to find a middle path, suggesting I could start pre-med and see how it feels, a compromise that wasn't actually a compromise at all, just a delay tactic dressed up as open-mindedness. I told him I already knew how it felt. I'd spent 17 years watching how it felt in that house, and I didn't want that particular feeling as my permanent address. I came home from a study session 3 days later to find my things already outside, on the porch, in black plastic bags lined up like they were waiting for pickup, because in a sense, they were. I counted them without meaning to, the way you count anything when your brain needs a task to keep from processing the actual event. 6 bags. My entire childhood room, compressed into 6 black plastic bags on a porch I'd grown up walking across barefoot every summer. A framed photo from a family vacation, years earlier, back when things had still felt uncomplicated, poked through a torn corner of one of them, corner bent, glass cracked. Photographs from the hallway had been turned face down inside, I found out later, a detail my mother apparently considered a mercy rather than the cruelty it actually was. My mother stood in the doorway, arms crossed, and said the sentence that would define the next 9 years of my life with a precision I don't think she fully understood until much later. You're dead to us until you fix this. Fix this. As if refusing a career path was a diagnosis, something with a clear course of treatment I simply hadn't agreed to follow yet. I didn't argue on that porch. I didn't beg. I picked up one duffel bag, left the rest for later, and walked to my car with a spine I didn't fully know I had until I needed it. My father stood a few feet behind my mother the entire time, saying nothing, which told me everything about where his loyalty actually lived when it mattered. I sat in my car outside that house for almost 20 minutes before I could make myself drive anywhere, hands shaking on the wheel in a way they hadn't during the actual confrontation. I called a friend from high school, one of the only numbers I had memorized without needing to look it up, and asked, as steadily as I could manage, if I could sleep on her couch for a few nights. She said yes immediately, no questions, the kind of immediate yes that tells you exactly who your real family is going to end up being. I drove to her apartment with one duffel bag and the address of a house I wouldn't set foot back inside for 9 years. The first year was a couch, then a room I could barely afford, the kind with walls thin enough to hear a stranger's television through, not unlike 100 other stories you've probably heard from people who got cut off young and had to build a floor underneath themselves from nothing. I remember a specific week that winter when my car wouldn't start and I couldn't afford the repair yet, so I walked 40 minutes each way to a job that paid barely above minimum wage, in shoes that weren't built for that kind of distance, because missing a shift wasn't an option when nobody was catching me if I fell. I remember eating the same discounted rice and canned vegetables for so many consecutive weeks that the smell of it, even now, brings back that specific cold, that specific tired. I took night classes when I could afford them and worked days at whatever paid, eventually landing my first real foothold, an entry-level administrative position in a hospital system, filing, scheduling, the unglamorous plumbing of healthcare that nobody romanticizes but everybody desperately needs. My first employee badge had a title on it so small it barely counted as one. I kept it anyway, pinned to a corkboard above my desk for years, a specific, humbling artifact of exactly where I'd started once the family safety net had been cut clean through. I still remember the interview for that job clearly, sitting across from a tired hiring manager who asked, almost as a formality, why a 19-year-old with strong academics wasn't in a pre-med track like it seemed I was clearly built for. I gave her a short, careful answer about wanting to understand healthcare from the operations side first. She nodded, unconvinced but not unkind, and hired me anyway, mostly, I think, because I was the only candidate who'd actually read the job posting closely enough to ask a real question about it. I remember calling a distant aunt once that year, one of the only relatives who hadn't fully cut contact, just to ask a practical question about renter's insurance. She asked, gently, whether I'd talked to my parents lately. I told her the truth, that I hadn't, that I didn't expect to for a long time. She was quiet for a moment and then said something I've carried with me since, your mother mistakes obedience for love. Don't let her convince you it's the other way around. I didn't fully understand how much I needed to hear that sentence until years later. There was nothing cinematic about that year. No montage. Just rent, and shifts, and slowly, deliberately, learning a system from its most unglamorous floor upward, one shift at a time. What happened after that first badge is the part I'm proudest of, because none of it required anyone's permission or blessing. Coordinator, then operations, then a lateral move into clinical trial logistics, a field I fell into almost by accident and then couldn't leave because I was, it turned out, genuinely good at it, the specific, unglamorous work of making sure research sites had what they needed, that budgets tracked against enrollment numbers, that a promising trial didn't collapse under its own paperwork before it ever reached a single patient. Eventually, a partnership role, building relationships between hospital systems and research programs, the kind of position that doesn't show up in movies but quietly determines whether new treatments reach people 2 years faster or 5. Somewhere in that stretch, I finished a master's degree at night, the same field I'd chosen at 19 at that kitchen table, health administration, except now it was funded entirely by my own income, on my own schedule, answerable to nobody's approval but the admissions committee's. I didn't send an announcement home. There was no home left to send one to. I want to be specific about this, because vague success stories are cheap and I don't deal in cheap. By year 6, I was managing a portfolio of hospital partnerships worth real budgets, real headcounts, real outcomes measured in actual patients enrolled in actual trials that actually mattered. Nobody handed me any of it. No lottery ticket, no rich mentor stepping in to smooth the path. Just years of being specifically, boringly excellent at logistics nobody else wanted to think hard enough about. There was a particular trial in year 5, a pediatric oncology study, that nearly collapsed because 3 of our partner sites couldn't align their enrollment timelines. I spent 6 straight weeks rebuilding that coordination from scratch, site by site, phone call by phone call, and when it finally launched on schedule, my supervisor pulled me aside and told me, plainly, that the work I'd done had probably saved the study entirely. I didn't call my mother to tell her. I didn't call anyone in my family at all. I went home, made myself a real dinner for once instead of something out of a can, and let that be enough. It was around year 7 that I first met Dr. Anita Shah, then a department head at one of the hospital systems I was building a partnership program with, later elevated to chair of the board. Our first meeting was entirely unglamorous, a budget dispute over site funding that could have gone badly if either of us had been less willing to actually listen. She respected precision, I'd learned, more than charm, and I gave her precision every single time we worked together over the following 3 years, clean numbers, honest timelines, no spin when a program underperformed. She never once asked about my family. She only ever asked about the work, which, by that point in my life, was exactly the kind of relationship I'd learned to value most. My birthdays came and went, unmarked, unacknowledged, a policy rather than an oversight, and I understood the difference clearly by year 2. Claire's milestones, meanwhile, flooded a family group chat I'd been quietly removed from without any formal announcement. I only found out because a cousin mentioned, in passing, how proud everyone was of Claire's match into a competitive residency program. I asked what group chat she meant. She looked at me like I'd asked what year it was. I found out about Claire's engagement almost a full year after it happened, again through that same cousin, at a family funeral neither branch of the family could avoid attending together. My mother saw me across the funeral home, nodded once, the smallest possible acknowledgement of my continued existence, and spent the rest of the reception talking to everyone except me. I stood near the refreshment table with my father for exactly 90 seconds of stilted small talk about traffic before he found an excuse to walk away too. Claire herself approached me briefly at that same funeral, awkward, clearly caught between 2 versions of loyalty she hadn't figured out how to reconcile. She congratulated me, vaguely, on doing well, a phrase that told me she genuinely had no specific information about my life to reference, only a general sense that I hadn't collapsed the way our mother's version of the story probably implied I should have. We didn't exchange numbers. Neither of us suggested it. My mother's Christmas card list, I discovered through that same cousin a year later, no longer included my name, not even as an afterthought, not even in the smallest font at the bottom. It was a small, specific erasure, the kind you'd almost call petty if it weren't so completely consistent with everything else. I finished my own master's degree quietly, no ceremony I bothered attending, no family in the audience because there was no family left to sit in it. I mailed myself, half-jokingly, a small congratulations card the week after, signed with my own name, because nobody else was going to do it and I decided the milestone deserved acknowledgement from somebody, even if that somebody had to be me. At year 4, my mother called, out of nowhere, her voice doing an approximation of warmth I hadn't heard directed at me since before the porch. She asked how I'd been, briefly, generically, the way you'd ask a coworker you barely know, and I answered just as generically, both of us skating over 4 years of silence like it was a scheduling gap rather than an amputation. She offered coffee. Just coffee, she said, like it was a small thing, a gesture of goodwill. Then she added the condition, almost as an afterthought, the way you'd mention a minor scheduling detail. If you're finally ready to reconsider school. Not a question about how I was doing. Not curiosity about the career I'd actually built. An offer of reconciliation with an asterisk attached, the same asterisk that had been attached to every version of her love I could remember. I told her no, calmly, the same way I'd tell a vendor their proposal didn't meet our requirements. She hung up on the word itself, mid-syllable, like the sound of my refusal was something she genuinely couldn't stand to let finish playing in her ear. I sat with the phone in my hand for a long time after that, not crying, mostly just confirming, once and for all, that 4 years hadn't changed a single term of her offer. I thought, afterward, about how easily I could have said yes to the coffee, just the coffee, and quietly let the school question sit unanswered for another hour over a table somewhere neutral. Some small, tired part of me wanted to. But I'd learned enough by then to recognize a foot already halfway back in a door I'd built, brick by brick, specifically to keep closed until I chose otherwise. Quick pause here, because if this is landing somewhere personal for you, do this before you walk into any room with people who only call when they want you smaller. Write your actual title down first. Identity before argument. Know exactly who you are walking in, so nobody in that room gets to decide it for you on your behalf. The wedding invitation, when it finally came, arrived late and wrong, forwarded through the wedding planner rather than sent directly, with a small handwritten note attached. Claire insisted on courtesy. Not warmth. Courtesy, a word chosen with the same clinical precision my family applied to everything. My +1 line was left blank, quietly denied without ever being formally denied. My seating assignment, when I checked the chart the planner had accidentally CC'd me on, placed me at a back table near the kitchen doors, the unofficial section reserved for people the hosts couldn't quite justify excluding but had no intention of featuring either. I called the planner directly, once, mostly to confirm the RSVP deadline rather than to make any kind of statement. She was warm and professional on the phone, clearly with no idea of the history behind the booking, and mentioned, almost in passing, that Claire had specifically asked for my details to be pulled from an old family contact list, since apparently nobody had my current information on hand. 9 years, and the family Rolodex hadn't updated once, not even enough to know which city I lived in. I sat with that invitation for 2 full days before deciding anything. Part of me wanted to decline outright, to protect 9 years of hard-won peace from a single evening of potential exposure. But another part of me, the part that had spent a career learning to read a room accurately instead of emotionally, wanted one clean, current data point instead of 9-year-old assumptions. I decided the data point was worth the risk. I wrote myself a rule that night on a sticky note, the same way I write every serious decision I make, because feelings without a framework tend to make bad choices at exactly the moments that matter most. Attend once. No speech. Let the room work. This wasn't revenge theater. I want to be completely clear about that, because I know how easily a story like this gets flattened into something uglier than it actually was. I wasn't walking into that wedding to detonate anything. I was walking in to collect one clean data point, to see, plainly, without agenda, what 9 years actually looked like laid next to each other in the same room, my family's version of me against the version I'd actually built with my own 2 hands. I won't pretend the decision was free of fear. There were mornings that week I genuinely considered declining, imagining every version of humiliation my mother might still be capable of producing. 9 years of practice hadn't dulled her instinct for it. What finally settled me wasn't courage exactly. It was the plain fact that I no longer needed anything from that room. I wasn't walking in hoping for approval. I was simply walking in, which, I've since learned, is an entirely different posture to hold. I dressed sharp, not try hard, the same instinct I use before walking into a hospital board meeting where I need to be taken seriously without appearing to be performing seriousness for anyone's benefit. I chose a dark navy dress, tailored, nothing that screamed for attention and nothing that shrank from it either. I remember standing in front of my mirror that morning thinking, with something close to amusement, that I was dressing for a boardroom I'd never actually be sitting in that day, and somehow that made the choice easier, not harder. I brought nothing to fund, no gift wrapped in the kind of guilt-driven generosity my family might have expected from someone trying to buy her way back into their good graces. I discovered, almost by accident, flipping through the wedding program the morning of, that I was listed on a page near the back, under a section for hospital partnership and donor acknowledgement tied to a fundraising initiative Claire's fiancé's family had organized, my professional title printed there, correctly, by someone who clearly had no idea it belonged to the daughter who'd been erased from the family Christmas card list 3 years running. I doubt my mother had read that page closely. I doubt she'd read it at all. At check-in, the young woman running the guest table paused for half a second over my name, glanced at a laminated sheet, and said, warmly, professionally, "Oh, Ms. Voss, you're actually listed with the partnership table, let me just find your updated card." A small clerical correction. A completely ordinary moment for her. For me, it was the first crack in a story my mother had spent 9 years carefully maintaining, a story where I was, at best, a cautionary footnote nobody needed to see correctly. I stood there for a second longer than necessary, watching her flip through a small stack of place cards, and felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't expected to feel that early in the evening, not triumph exactly, just a quiet, factual confirmation that the paperwork, at least, already knew something my family hadn't caught up to yet. My pulse stayed steady the entire time. I'd trained for exactly this kind of pressure in boardrooms for the better part of a decade. A cocktail hour, it turned out, was nothing compared to defending a research budget in front of a skeptical hospital CFO. Cocktail hour. My mother spotted me near the bar, and I watched recognition cross her face in real time, followed almost immediately by something colder. She said it loud enough for the small cluster of guests around us to catch every word, pitched with the specific, practiced cruelty of someone who has spent decades believing volume is the same thing as authority. I don't know how she got on the list, honestly. This is exactly the kind of thing that happens when a planner doesn't check with the family first. Defect. Embarrassment. Who invited the disappointment? She didn't use those exact words in that order, but the shape of the sentence, once you strip the politeness off it, said all three at once. Claire, a few feet away in her wedding dress, froze completely, her champagne glass suspended halfway to her mouth. My father appeared at my mother's elbow a half-second later, close enough to whisper, not to me, to her, "Don't make a scene," protecting the room's comfort instead of his daughter's dignity, exactly the way he always had. The small cluster around us did the thing strangers do when they've just witnessed something they weren't supposed to, a few sudden, fascinated glances, one woman's hand rising slightly to her own mouth, someone else finding an urgent reason to check their phone. Nobody said anything out loud. Nobody needed to. I could feel the temperature of the group shift, not toward me exactly, but away from my mother, a small, silent recalibration she was too focused on me to notice happening around her. I didn't cry. I want to be specific about that, because I know some of you are waiting for tears, and I'm not going to give you a version of this story that isn't true just because it would be more satisfying. I didn't deliver a clapback monologue either, no righteous speech cataloging 9 years of grievances for an audience of strangers holding hors d'oeuvres. I gave the room exactly one line: calm, level, final. I'm not here to debate what happened when I was 19. Then I stepped back, physically, half a pace, and let the small crowd around us do what crowds at weddings do when something uncomfortable happens in front of them, process it silently, form their own conclusions, and wait to see what happened next. I didn't need to control that. I'd learned, over 9 years of boardrooms, that the loudest person in a tense room rarely wins it. The steadiest one does. A woman near me, someone I didn't recognize, touched my arm briefly and said, quietly, that was impressively calm. I thanked her and meant it, though I didn't tell her that the calm hadn't been impressive to me at all. It had simply been the only tool I had left after 9 years of practicing it on far harder rooms than this one. A few minutes later, the event's host, Dr. Anita Shah, chair of the hospital board I'd spent 3 years building a partnership program with, invited to the wedding through Claire's fiancé's family entirely by coincidence, stepped up for a toast segment, tapping her glass gently for attention. I hadn't even realized she was in the room until that moment. Hospital board chairs and wedding guest lists don't usually overlap in any way I'd have predicted, and for a half second, watching her rise, I genuinely thought I might be imagining her out of sheer wishful nervousness. She thanked the families, said a few warm words about Claire and her new husband, and then, almost in passing, mentioned that she was delighted to see a colleague in the room, someone whose partnership work had directly expanded trial access for hundreds of patients across 3 hospital systems that year alone. She said my name. She said my actual title, in full, the one printed correctly on a program page my mother had never bothered to read. I watched my mother's face lose color in real time, the specific, visible drain of someone realizing the story she'd been telling for 9 years had just been publicly, casually, factually corrected by someone with absolutely no stake in the family drama, someone who had no idea she was correcting anything at all. She was simply stating a fact she happened to know. They wanted a cautionary tale. The program printed a bio instead. Claire, standing near the head table, turned to look at me across the room, and for a moment her expression wasn't the bride's polite composure anymore. It was something rawer, something closer to the sister I vaguely remembered from before either of us had learned to perform for that house. My father set his drink down slowly, entirely still, watching my mother rather than me, waiting, I think, to see how she'd recover. The room turned, the way rooms do, dozens of small conversations shifting focus toward me for a moment, curious, impressed, entirely unaware of the porch, the trash bags, the 9 years of silence sitting underneath that one warm sentence from a stranger with a microphone. People began introducing themselves to me after that, colleagues of colleagues, a few parents of the groom's side who worked adjacent to healthcare and wanted to know more about the partnership program Dr. Shah had mentioned. I answered every question plainly, professionally, the same way I'd answer them at any industry event, because that's exactly what this had quietly become. One older gentleman, the groom's uncle, shook my hand warmly and said he wished more young people went into the unglamorous side of healthcare instead of chasing prestige, entirely unaware of how precisely, and how painfully, that sentence landed for me. A second conversation stayed with me longer, with a young resident physician who'd overheard the toast and drifted over, curious, asking genuine questions about how partnership funding actually worked between hospital systems and research programs. Somewhere in the middle of explaining it, I realized I was having, for the first time all evening, a completely ordinary professional conversation at a family event, the exact normal thing other people apparently got to take for granted their whole lives. Claire found me near the edge of the dance floor a little later, still in her dress, her earlier freeze replaced by something softer, quieter, harder to read. She didn't say much. I let her not say much. My mother approached last, once the room's attention had moved on to other things, and tried the rewrite I half expected from the moment Dr. Shaw put down the microphone. "We always knew you'd land somewhere," she said, light, almost proud, as if 9 years of silence had been a supportive incubation period rather than an active eviction. I didn't gift her that rewrite. I didn't correct her loudly either. I simply didn't confirm it, and let the silence between us say what it needed to say without my help. Later, near the coat check, my mother caught up with me one more time, this version of her quieter, angling for something specific. "Photos together, for the family album," she said. Introductions to people in my network, since apparently I had one worth introducing her to now. A version of closeness that required nothing from her except proximity to what I'd built. "You look wonderful," she said, and I could hear her actually meaning it, in her own limited way, which somehow made the whole exchange harder rather than easier. "We should talk properly. Soon." I gave her terms instead, calm, clear, final. A relationship was possible, going forward, if she wanted one. A rewritten history was not required reading for me to consider it. I would not perform as a public daughter for hire whenever it was convenient for her narrative. And my professional network was not an apology gift she got to unwrap simply because 9 years had passed without her ever once saying the word sorry. She didn't argue with any of it. That, more than anything else that night, told me how much the room's reaction had actually moved something loose in her. My father found me separately, a few minutes after my mother had walked away to rejoin the reception. He didn't ask for photos or introductions. He just stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, and said, quietly, "I should have said something that night." On the porch. It wasn't quite an apology, not fully, not the way I might have written it myself if I'd been drafting his lines. But it was the first time in 9 years he'd acknowledged the porch existed at all, and I decided to let that count for exactly what it was, no more, no less. "You still could," I told him. "It's just 9 years later than it needed to be." He nodded, once, and didn't try to fill the silence after that, which was, in its own limited way, more respect than he'd shown me in a very long time. Claire found a quiet moment with me before I left, no cameras, no audience this time. She apologized, briefly, for the silence, for never once reaching out on her own across 9 years, admitted she'd been afraid of what it would cost her at home if she had. "I used to think about texting you," she said, twisting her new ring absently around her finger. "I just never knew what I'd even say after that long." I told her that most people don't, that the not knowing is usually the whole obstacle, bigger than any actual grievance underneath it. I accepted the honesty. I didn't accept a forced hug or an instant, tearful reunion, because neither of us had earned that yet, and pretending otherwise would have been its own kind of lie. "Can I text you sometime?" she asked, quieter now, the wedding day performance finally dropping away from her voice entirely. "Not about them. Just about you." I told her yes, that I'd like that, and I meant it, because Claire, unlike our parents, had never actually put a single bag on that porch herself. She'd just been too afraid, for too long, to ask about the ones already sitting there. "You got the coat," I told her, gently, without bitterness. I got my name back. Here's the verdict. I think, sometimes, about the girl on that porch at 19, counting 6 black trash bags without meaning to, spine shaking even as she made herself stand up straight. I wish I could tell her exactly how far away that porch would eventually feel, how completely a stranger with a microphone would settle an argument 9 years of family silence had never managed to win. I think she'd have believed me. She was always steadier than anyone in that house gave her credit for. Debt to us is a policy, not a fact of nature, and policies can expire, on your paperwork, on your terms, whether or not the people who wrote them ever feel a single ounce of guilt about it. If your family only recognizes you the moment a stranger says your title out loud, believe the stranger, not the 9 years of silence that came before them. Build your version of the truth anyway, quietly, on paper, in a career, in a life that doesn't require their signature to be real. You don't need a wedding, or a host with a microphone, or a room full of witnesses to make your own life real. Those things help, they're satisfying in a way I won't pretend they aren't, but the actual proof was never in that ballroom. It was in every quiet year before it, the ones nobody was watching, the ones that built the woman who could stand there completely steady when her mother finally noticed her again. You didn't invite a daughter that night. They ran into a colleague, and the room believed her. This is calm verdict. Quiet power. Final justice. On the record. Subscribe if you want more stories that settle the score without screaming. And tell me, in one word, were you disowned, or did you take back your title? I read every one. I'll see you in the next one.